Close enough. Hey everyone. My name's Dan Kaminsky. I'm out here from the States, having a great time out here. And I am here to talk to you about the horrible mess of dots we're seeing going by. Anyone have an idea what that is? This is MD5. It is a fingerprinting algorithm with some popularity. This is actually a visualization of the internals of MD5. For all we see of letters and hex, MD5 operates on bits. That's a progression of the bits going on. So what am I here to talk to you about today? See if we can pull up my slides here. MD5 to be considered harmful someday. MD5 is pretty popular. It's all over the place. It's in all sorts of algorithms. It's in all sorts of systems. It's a hashing algorithm. Put simply, it takes a fingerprint of data. It's very easy to synthesize the fingerprint. I have my finger. I push here. I've left a fingerprint. Cool. It's a little harder for me to grow a finger that will specifically match that print, or hard for you. I already come installed with one. Thank you. But no, that's the idea, that it's a one-way function that is difficult to invert. Now, it's been known since about 1997 that MD5 wasn't exactly going to work forever. Hans Dauberton of German National Security actually found the initial problem with what's called the compression function, and for about almost 10 years, no one actually put together two files that had the same fingerprint or the same hash. Recently, this threat became substantially less theoretical. Xiaoyun Wang at Shandong University actually went ahead and released hash collisions for MD5. Actually, 3 other hashing algorithms, RIPE-MD, something else, MD4. The predecessor to MD5, MD4, can actually be broken by hand now. It's like a 2 to the 4 work effort. It's pretty nasty. Now, we don't have the actual attack. All we have is the test vectors. Nice little things that say, hey, there's a problem, and we're not going to tell you how we found it. Now, for a couple reasons, because of this approach, they're not saying their methods, they're not explaining what's going on, and, well, they're Chinese. There's been some denial that this is a problem. A lot of apologizing from MD5. Oh, you don't need to worry that we are totally violating everything we've ever said in hash is supposed to do. Don't worry about it. This talk is here to tell you to worry. Now, we do have a poor, actually, we'll just skip this slide entirely. Well, no, there's one thing to say here. It's been established for a substantial amount of time that the quote-unquote cryptographic strength level of MD5, which is a 128-bit hash, has 128 bits, that the strength level is 2 to the 64, meaning it would take 2 to the 64 operations, very relatively large amount of operations, almost but not quite outside the range of imaginability, to create something that qualifies as a problem. Now, what we get from Wang is pretty much exactly what we got from the birthday attack. And that's what this is called, this birthday attack thing. Only instead of taking 2 to the 64 work, we now have 2 to the 24 to 2 to the 32. That's between 16 million operations and 4 billion operations. If you look on in your PC, you have like a 4 gig processor, 4 gigahertz, 4 billion operations. Yeah, so it's not exactly that fast. I am kind of, cheating, but seriously, 2 to the 24 to 2 to the 32 work efforts, not that hard. The attacks by Xiaoyun take about an hour. Hour is not what I consider a secure work effort barrier. So here's our question of the day. Is it possible, with nothing but the 2 test vectors that we've gotten, nothing else, because we're not going to get the attack anytime soon, but with just what we have, with just these 2 files, can we do something nasty? And yeah, we can. Now I got to say, this is early, this is rudimentary, this is not the Bic pen or the tubular lock of MD5, which, you guys hear about this? You take a 50-cent pen, you put it into a $200 bike lock, you now have a $500 bike. Yeah, that was kind of, it's always funny when you see like hacker philosophy attached to the real world. People are like, oh my God, there's a massive vulnerability. And meanwhile, we're like, yeah, you're vulnerable to cutters. So So this is not some huge, massive, everything's coming to an end, which is why I say someday. But these are things that I consider interesting. What are the points that I want you to walk away from here? My main thesis is that MD5 presents a functionally weaker security constraint than what we've been led to expect from the cryptographically secure hash primitive in general and SHA-1 in particular. There are two things we can no longer do. We can no longer create an association between an MD5 hash of some data and the executable instructions contained within. And we can no longer state that a particular MD5 set of information correlates with only one actual payload of data. And I'm going to show you how that can be proved quite quickly. So, how does MD5 work? MD5 is a block-based algorithm. I'm not going to go too into depth here, but the basic idea is this. You start with some 128-bit system state. It's arbitrary, and it's calculated from some general mathematical constants. This 128-bit state is stirred by 512 bits of our payload. You can just imagine shuffling, stirring, finding different ways of putting them together. This stirring is repeated over and over, another 512 bits, another 512 bits, another 512 bits, until there's no more data. And now what are you left with? Well, you started with 128 bits. You end with 128 bits. It's just they're very stirred together. The security of the algorithm is provided by the difficulty of figuring out precisely how to stir this initial state into whatever you're looking for. So in other words, I have 128 ones and zeros, and I want to get it to a different set of 128 ones and zeros. It's actually really complicated for me to figure out what precise input data-wise with those 512 bits to use in order to cause a stir to end up with a particular result. It's a little like trying to, here's a good analogy, it's like trying to shuffle cards and specify the actual output of cards. I want all spades, then 2, 3, 4, 5, and that's really hard compared to just shuffling and doing whatever comes naturally. How does the attack work? Don't know. I'd like to know. I'm serious. I'd really like to know how the attack works. It's an extension of Hans Dauberton's attack. It somehow uses Anton Jou's multi-collision paper research. What I can show you is actually what's supposed to happen in MD5 and what's actually occurring. Now, what we have here is, you guys saw the MD5 stuff at the beginning of the talk. This is a comparison of two files with a single bit has been changed near the beginning. What you see inside the MD5 function is very quickly everything starts to change. Lots of ones turn to zeros, lots of zeros turns to ones. So a dot is a 1, blank space is a 0. Lots of things changing. Let's see what's happening inside of the Wang attack. Not so much. Pretty much right after we exit the first internal function of MD5, everything else stays constant. There are small flips after the first major round, the first set of 512 bits. That's what this line right here is. The two files are actually only different by 1, 2, 3, 4. That line has maybe 4 or 5 bits that are different. And then the next round, even though it goes off the bottom of the screen, the next round actually undoes those differences. So we really have something moderately spectacular in terms of mathematics. We'd love to know how it works, but we don't need to. We can still do nasty stuff. Thank you very much. So there's a curious trait of block-based hashes. If two files have the same hash, in other words, if after all of your stirring at some point you end up with a collision, the two end up same fingerprint. If you put more data on the end, as long as it's the same data that you appended to both files, they're still going to be the same. In mathematical terms, if the MD5 hash of x equals the MD5 hash of y, then the MD5 hash of x plus q is going to equal the MD5 hash of y plus q. Now, why is this true? Well, all the difference between what happened before is meant to be encapsulated in this interim sum, in this output from the system. If the outputs from both systems collide into the same value, the fact that earlier on there was differences has been erased. The two are now the same, and if you imagine them like chaotic functions, that keep on jerking up and down, as soon as these two functions are equal, they will continue to jerk in parallel with each other. So now we can do some neat stuff with this. Definitions. vec1, vec2. These are our two test vectors as released by Xiaoyun Wang. Payload. Payload is just a set of commands to do some stuff. Encrypted payload. All we're going to do is take our arbitrary set of commands and we're going to encrypt it using the SHA-1 hash of vec1 as the key. Now, just because these two files released by Xiaoyun Wang have the same MD5 hash, they do not have the same SHA-1 hash. So what that means is that, the vec1's SHA-1 is going to be different than vec2's SHA-1, and it's actually meaningful. We're taking the SHA-1 hash as a key. So, two files, Fire and Ice. Fire is composed of vec1 and the encrypted payload appended to the end. Ice is composed of vec2 and the encrypted payload appended on the end. Note, the same thing has been appended to both files. Fire actually contains sufficient context to be decrypted and executed. You're sitting there, you're looking at Fire, okay, I've got Fire right here, I've got the vec1, I take the SHA-1 of the first 128 bytes of here, this gives me some key, I throw that into my AES, and hey look, it decrypts fine, and I run off and execute the payload. So again, just making sure it's clear, vec1, I break the vec1 out of Fire, I SHA-1 it, I get a key that goes to the encrypted payload that's attached, encrypted payload becomes payload, payload becomes executed, nasty things happen. But you can't do that with Ice, because Ice doesn't contain vec1. You can go ahead and take the SHA-1 hash of vec2, and it'll give you some 160-bit sequence of data, but it's not going to decrypt anything. So what are you stuck with? You're stuck with the encrypted payload, which looks like a whole bunch of random data. Now, Fire does nastiness, Ice does nothing. Fire and Ice have the same MD5 hash. Remember, if MD5X plus Q is going to equal MD5Y plus Q, Q is equal to the encrypted payload. So let me give you a demonstration of what this looks like, because this is not merely theoretical. This is written in a tool called Stripwire. Here's what we got here. These are the two test vectors as released by Wang. As you can see, they're very similar. There's actually only 6 bits different that are between them. In vec1, this byte is 87. In vec2, this byte is 07. In vec1, this byte is B4. In vec2, this byte is 34. And just so you realize, the reason I have a line in between here, remember I said that MD5 has a 512-bit block size. It works on 512 bits at a time. This section up here, these 4 lines, that's the first 512 bits. This is the second 512 bits. Do you notice that the positions of the offsets are actually identical? This seems to be part of the attack, part of the mechanism that it works. So in between the two blocks, the bits that are offset are in the same position. And obviously the bits that are offset between vec1 and vec2 are in the same position as well. This is in the same position as here. Equivalence. Let me go ahead and show you. Yes, they do indeed have the same MD5 hash. They do not have the same SHA-1 hash. So these two values are quite the same. These two values are quite different. Now let's go ahead, create some arbitrary data. We're going to pull out of a random number generator. We're going to get a megabyte of it, and we're going to output it to a file called arbitrary data. We're going to concatenate vec1 in the arbitrary data, and we're going to get v1 arb. We're going to cat vec2 in the arbitrary data, and we get v2 arb. So we end up with little over 1 megabyte files, and will you look at that? They still have the same MD5 hash, but they still have different SHA-1 sums. And importantly, the differences are still there. They're still very distinct files. They are not binary identical. Our payload. This is written by a friend of mine, Sammy Kamkar. This is a, 5-line root shell written in Perl. It opens up a pseudo shell on port 50023. This is what we are going to put into Fire to be executed. We're going to package this. We run stripwire. We have it go verbose, and we have it embed the package /.pl. And that was the name of the file you saw. Fire.bin. As you see, it has its MD5 sum of this big value. ICE.bin has this MD5 sum, same thing. SHA-1s are different between the two. Now look, when we use stripwire, because we have to use stripwire has to be an execution harness at the moment, and I'll discuss avoiding that in later. But if stripwire goes ahead and tries to launch ice.bin, it's unable to decrypt it because the SHA-1 hash of vec2 does not decrypt ice. But look what happens when we run fire. We run fire, we telnet locally, and look, we have a shell, and we can go ahead and cat out the SSH private key. Two files, two radically different behaviors, same MD5 hash. So, what does this mean? Is tripwire dead? Oh, no. It's bad, but it's not dead. Now, there are two common arguments that are used, and they're somewhat real. They're actually relatively legitimate. The first argument is to what's called externality, which is that, you can't really say that the behavior of some application is defined by just the bits that are inside it. I mean, there's a whole world of things that can change the behavior of your application. The hardware can be different. The file name can be different. The network metadata, oh, I see that you have this IP address. I'm going to erase your hard drive. Absolutely, you can do that. There are memory-only exploits. In other words, someone owns your daemon over the network, never touches the disk drive, but goes ahead and causes your machine to your file server to start not checking passwords. It's kind of an important thing for file servers to do. There can be a random number generator inside. It doesn't even care. It just behaves as it wants. One person had this great thing. I could write a program that went onto the internet and downloaded all new code and just ran that. And now look how our program has different behavior even though it has the same hash. Well, yes, I mean, it's true. Programs can do different things no matter what's inside. And then there's a second argument, and that's what's called the infallible auditor argument, which is basically, fire was not generated with prior knowledge of ice. It isn't like we had something that everyone already trusted as safe, like, say, the NTFS driver in Windows XP. You had to actually know when ice was generated that you really had this other nasty behavior in fire, and you wanted this to actually be what ran. So, why would any auditor rationally say, hey, I see this ice, and I see this random content, and I see it's trying to do nasty stuff. Why would I ever trust this? Why would I ever like that? And that's actually kind of a legitimate argument as well. And let's deal with that. And by the way, these are the reasons why I'm saying someday. Hang on. Does tripwire have a problem? Yes. Let's discuss the externality argument. Yeah. Commands can indeed be gotten from outside. I can indeed go to the outside world or analyze various aspects of outside, but you know what? At the end of the day, we are adding additional bits of information from outside the data set that was MD5 hashed. In other words, we're getting new stuff. We're cheating. We're looking around the universe for stuff to grab. It is not self-contained inside of the file that was MD5 hashed. But now we can. Now we can look inside the file that's MD5 hashed because the file that's MD5 hashed either contains vec1 or vec2. There is a single bit of information. It is contained inside the file that was hashed. It is what differentiates fire and ice, and that bit of information survived the MD5 hashing process and is being allowed to alter the behavior of the system. In other words, yes, you can always cheat by going outside. But now, we don't need to cheat. We don't need to go outside. We don't need to introduce network behavior. We don't need to depend on the random behavior of a random number generator. We can know. This code will either never, ever do anything nasty because it is ice, or this code will always, always cause harm because it is fire. But now let's talk about the infallible auditor argument. Who would trust ice? This is legitimate. In general, in a perfect world, auditors can go ahead and look at code and know every possible thing that it does. In an absolutely perfect world, except that this isn't a perfect world, and there is the whole concept of the halting problem, which does actually limit what an auditor can analyze by looking at code. You can't actually define, looking at a piece of code, all possible branches it will go down. But even if you could, with ice, all possible branches that it can go down still go down a safe path. So you would have to do testing to the point of not only knowing what this piece of code does, you'd have to know what other variants of this exact piece of code would also do. this starts getting to the realm of unrealisticness. Now, in terms of an auditor's perspective, an auditor right now with Stripwire has to go ahead. It's not like it says, go own the system. It's not like Backlash is in plain text. The auditor would have to recognize encrypted content, recognize it for what it is, assume based on the decryption process that it's doing something nasty, and flag, which is possible. It's a very difficult process. It's also completely impossible with what's called black box testing, where you simply provide all inputs possible, because there are no inputs that will turn ice into fire. There are other ways of obfuscating the matter. I can have a JPEG, and inside the JPEG I have my nasty block that varies the behavior from one set to the other. The bottom line is you can't depend on the auditor necessarily finding the problem, and B, it's a second line of defense. It's like, if I have a system that's vulnerable to one bug but not vulnerable to the other, and because of the other bug, the first exploit doesn't necessarily work as well as possible, first exploit's still there. In other words, it's orthogonal. It's a completely, yes, an auditor might find a problem and is a second line of defense, but our first line, the fact that we expect the hash to change when data changes, that fell. That being said, there is indeed a situation in which the deviation of the MD5 sums could never, ever be detected by any auditor. And this is completely cryptographic. It turns out Diffie-Hellman is a common algorithm used in cryptography, and I'm not going to go too into depth about how it works, but Diffie-Hellman has a dependency on there being a prime number at its core, and this prime number is manipulated in certain ways. Now, if the value is prime, the security works. If the value is not prime, the security completely fails. I go to the auditor and I deliver to the auditor a version where VEC1 is what is attached. It's VEC1 concatenated with all those zeros and a 1B. Now that value is totally prime. That completely fulfills the requirements of Diffie-Hellman. But what do I actually ship? I actually ship VEC2 with all those zeros and the 1B attached. And that's not prime. And that causes Diffie-Hellman to completely fall apart. No auditor could ever look at a piece of code and be aware, okay, I see that a different conflation of MD5 would allow this to happen. There is no context. And what I'm saying is that there's no extra code that is expanding our 6 bits of difference into some arbitrary payload. The MD5 collision itself is being directly employed as an entity in a crypto system, and that is causing a fundamental failure. Now let's talk about some applied failure scenarios. First of all, I call this the auditor bypass. The developers send one payload to the testers, to the auditors, and they send another to the factory. Now, you can actually, turns out, look at developers as auditors too. I mean, after all, they would like to know the behavior of their code once they run it, and they want to see if it works. All right. So you go ahead and you infect, as an attacker, you infect their build tools. And you have everything that they emit in their debug mode always is safe. The only time it's ever going to swap out what is safe for what is unsafe is when it's actually being sent off to the factory to be deployed. Now the code gets out there, the developer's like, I can't believe this is buggy. Maybe they didn't ship the right stuff. And they go ahead and they MD5 stuff, the CDs that went out of the factory, and oh, it has the exact same hash. So if nothing else, they're on the hook, because obviously their code caused a whole bunch of problems. Let's also talk about distributed package management. It's a very common thing. Ports trees, Gen2, a couple other things will have solutions where you'll have MD5 hashes centrally distributed along with a list of all the packages you could possibly download from the internet and URLs where to get them. Here's the idea. I go ahead and from some trusted place get this index of trusted content. And it gives me all the hashes, gives me all the URLs. I go to one of the URLs, I download the content, and now I compare the hash of what I downloaded with the hash that I have in my ports tree from my trusted source. If the hashes match, I install. If the hashes do not match, oh, I go, something's wrong. This is not what I trusted. This is not what they trusted. This is a problem. And then it errors out, and maybe it allows you to override, but often it doesn't. So Here's your attack. I go ahead and for a year I host good content. Does nothing, always has ice. And that's what's in the port tree. But eventually, somebody goes ahead and tries to install my code from somewhere that I want to attack. I want to attack some big company, and I go ahead and I wait for someone from that company to download from my site. And this time, instead of giving them the ice package, I give them the fire package. And when they get it, they still want to make sure they got the same MD5 hash. They check, they see the same MD5 hash, they install it, and they're quite owned. My point, there are indeed other ways of making this happen. And like I said, you can check DNS trees or whatnot. But now you can do this in a manner that's actually entirely self-contained within the file. You get absolute guarantee that this code is going to behave in this manner. Bit commitment also fails. I'm actually talking about this for a kind of funny reason. So this is talked about by some Slashdot. I'm embarrassed they didn't actually go ahead and grab his name. But here's a potential cryptographically related attack case. Crypto game. Alice sends Bob and comes up with some random data and sends Bob an MD5 hash of the data, committing her to that data set. In other words, she has to at some point show that she has the data that created this MD5 hash. Bob is going to make bets. Bob is going to bet that he guesses what Alice has. Now what's supposed to happen is this. Bob registers his bets, Alice sends the data, Bob is able to verify the hash, verify the data, and Alice and Bob can agree, oh, I see, I bet right here, or wrong here, and whatnot. That's the intended behavior. But now we have a completely new situation, because there are multiple payloads, multiple data sets that can have the same hash. Alice can go ahead, look at what Bob bet, and said, oh, Bob bet on this bit being 1, this bit being 0. Well, here I now have an MD5, a file with these bits set to these values. This is going to save me money. Alice can choose which payload to send back to Bob. Alice's bit commitment is relatively broken. Now, there's a reason I'm bringing this up. This is kind of funny. Pull up a web browser here. Hopefully it'll actually work. So MD5 is a chaotic function, which means, of course, some people have thought, well, we can use this as a random number generator. We feed a couple numbers into it, and it'll just keep on, giving us random values. And there we go. We can use that for gambling. There's actually a decent number of gambling sites who use MD5 as a random number generator. Let's see what we got here. So let's see. Casino on Net uses the trusted MD5 RNG, which has been tested to provide 100% random results. And let's see. Pacific Poker uses the trusted MD5 RNG, which provides absolutely random results. And 88 Casino uses the trusted MD5 RNG, which provides absolutely random results. These writers aren't very random, are they? There's 1,920 online casinos that all use the MD5 RNG because it provides trusted random results. I'll give you a hint, they're the same casino. Kind of amusing. So, the still secret actual attack. We don't have the actual attack. I'd love it. We could do lots and lots more with it, but we don't have it. Everything we've done has been just with the test vectors. These are append only. We only get a single bit of information. Was our file prepended with vec1, or was our file prepended with vec2? That's one bit of data. Now the actual attack is a lot more powerful. It adjusts to any state in the MD5 state machine. What that means is we aren't limited to just appending data to the end of our two hashes. We can actually shove data before. So you'd have like a nice executable header, big old program, does a bunch of stuff, and right about now we'll have a block that can be swapped out for some other block. Because that's what we actually are generating here. We're generating what I call doppelganger blocks. These blocks can be swapped out for one another without changing the eventual hash. So the first thing the actual attack does is it allows us to inject data into the middle of a file that may be altered. And the second thing we can do, we aren't limited to just 2 collisions. We can actually have what are called n multi-collisions. This is actually what Antoine Jou found. If it is possible, given a hashing algorithm, to create 2 files with the same MD5 hash, it's not that much harder to create, say, 30, which is actually one of the things that supposedly Wang did to silence her detractors. She released 30 files with the same hash. So there's something kind of interesting we can do with this trait, and I'll tell you about it in a sec. Now, one thing we can do with the new MD5 attacks, there's been a lot of discussion about HMAC. HMAC is a keyed mode of MD5, and there's been a lot of claims that HMAC, by its very nature, is entirely immune to the Wang attack. Is this true? Well, let's look at this for a second. HMAC is composed of 2 rounds of MD5ing. We have the inner round, in which we have the key, whatever our key happens to be, but it's going to be 1 block size no matter what. We XOR the key with OX36s, so it gets shuffled a bit, and we append to that the data. Now we end up with some MD5 value. We take that MD5 value, we append it to some other version of the key, this time XORed against OX5C, and we take the MD5 of that mass, and that gives us our outer hash. And the outer hash is defined as what the value is for HMAC MD5. Now, it's been said that this is totally immune. It's not actually totally immune. I mean, what we basically have here is, right here we have some data, key XOR OX36, being prepended to the data. This prepending changes the initial state that the data has to be integrated into. That would be a problem, except for the fact that the actual attack adapts to any initial state. So it's not too much of a problem. We create, assuming we have the key, which is a gigantic assumption, assuming we have the key, we can go ahead and adapt to the initial state output by the key, and we end up with a collision at inner. Now, once we have a collision at inner, getting a collision at outer is automatic, because, this data is the same if VEC1's in there or VEC2's in there. So outer is, I guess you can't see my finger, so I'll do this. There. That's inner. Now, once we have a collision in the inner round, we have a collision in the, we have a collision in the outer round. Now, if it happened that the data was in the outer round as well, this would not be possible. Be completely infeasible, because now we would have to somehow be able to adapt our data to 2 different initial states simultaneously. We would need to adapt the data to the key XOR OX36, and we need to adapt against the key XOR OX5C. This is not possible given the Wang attack. That being said, it's arguably invulnerable enough. The MAC primitive, the idea of having a keyed function, it's not supposed to survive if the key goes away. In fact, pretty much every other message authenticating code, that's what MAC stands for, algorithm, does indeed completely fall apart when the key is known. So this mostly obviates all the applied risks. We already presume that our systems get to fall apart if the key leaks. That being said, we can still note, first of all, we've never been able to create an HMAC MD5 collision before, because MD5 has actually been sort of collision resistant. Secondly, HMAC MD5 has degraded. A layer of security has fallen away. Yes, lots of other Macs are at this level that HMAC MD5 has fallen to. Yes, this level of security is completely and totally acceptable, but we cannot deny the fact that HMAC SHA-1 has a level of security that HMAC MD5 cannot offer. Finally, there are actually applied uses. Microsoft's Xbox makes their signatures using HMAC SHA-1. Microsoft does not actually want there to be collisions inside of what their digital signature algorithms sign. So they actually have a desire for collision resistance and for macking. This is not a completely unimaginable cryptographic experience, unrealistic, undesirable. It's actually pretty reasonable. So it happens that you'd want both with HMAC MD5, you just don't get it. What do we have here? This is fun. So, let's talk about bits for a second. You know why I keep saying we get a single bit of information when we're dealing with VEC1 versus VEC2? Well, the attack, as I said, lets us compute more than 2 collisions. We can compute any number. Now, let's say we compute 4 collisions for the same data. That gives us 2 bits of information. Reasonable. Let's say we compute 256 collisions. Well, now we get 8 bits of information. No, it's getting more and more expensive to add bits of information in this manner. If we wanted to get 16 bits of information, we'd have to calculate 65,000 attacks. That gets problematic. But, like I told you guys, we can go ahead and we're not tied to the default initial state of MD5. We can go ahead and have attacks anywhere. And here's how we do this. So here's what we can do. We basically create set after set after set of what I call these doppelganger blocks. Each one of them is 256 times long. So the first 256 set is made against the default initial state. The second 256 set is made against the MD5 hash after the first set. The third adapts to the second, the fourth adapts to the third, and what you end up with is when you have 16 of these doppelganger sets, each with 256 possibilities, you get 16 times 8 bits, you get 128 bits of information, in what ends up being 2048 bytes. Now what can we possibly do with this? Well, first of all, this is actually somewhat steganographic. We actually have an approach not against humans, but against a cryptographically strong hashing algorithm that allows us to embed arbitrary information inside of a file in a way that MD5 cannot see. That's interesting because MD5's whole purpose in life is to tell us if any data has changed. We can change any of these 128 bits and nothing happens. We can actually do more and more. We can do an arbitrary amount of data if we're willing to accept ungodly bad efficiency. I think it's what, 99.7% inefficient? It's not good. Now, creating constant hashes given variable data, this has actually happened before. For like CRC32, for TCP/IP's checksums, it's relatively easy to calculate new data that will have the same hash as old data. But be that as it may, MD5 promises a little more than CRC32. MD5 actually promises you the data hasn't changed. But look at this, we got 128 bits here. Why is it changing? So, let's start messing with peer-to-peer networks. And I'm not taking sides here. I'm just, it's a hugely used application and, let's mess with it. So, MP3 players have a nice little thing they do. If you give them garbage, they go, that's not an MP3 block, and it skips it. What we can do, and actually the first thing I ever did was point out you can take VEC1 or VEC2 and prepend them to an MP3, and the MP3 still plays. It'll just skip over the garbage block at the beginning. Now when you have only 1 bit difference, that's not useful. Ooh, 1. Wow, I've really learned a lot. But check out what we can do. With a 128-bit signature, I can put a host on the Kazaa network, and this host sends out a different signatured file to everyone who downloads some song from me. Now, why would I do this? Well, I am first generation. I hand out music to second generation. Second generation hands out music to third and fourth and whatnot. Third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, all of these people can go ahead and have a signature embedded in them that says who they were, who the second generation was. I see. This is the version of this track that went to 1.2.3.4 username Bob. This is the track that went to 8.3.2.25 that went to username Foo. And now here's the question. Why would I go ahead and not just put this in an ID3 tag? Why not just append it to the end? I sent this file to this guy, and now I'm going to trace his file as it goes through the network. Well, the thing is that peer-to-peer networks use MD5 hashes for 2 distinct purposes. First of all, they want to coalesce identical information. I may change the file name, and in fact I usually do change the file names of files that I download to be, standard with my own personal standards. What's done often is to, whatever the file name happens to be, take the MD5 hash. And if you're searching for a file, or if you're searching to resume a file you already started downloading, you search for other files with that same MD5 hash. Pretty nice. But if you're going ahead and you say, oh, this is the version for Bob, this is the version for Mary, this is the version for Jim, all of these different files are going to have different MD5 hashes, and they're not going to show up in the same searches, and it's going to be really obvious something is messed up. The other thing that the algorithms do is they go ahead and they're used for integrity. I want to know I'm downloading the same thing that everyone else is downloading. If the MD5 changes because there's all this information about someone, well, then I'm going to notice, the version for Bob and the version for Mary may have the same MP3 content, but they've got some other stuff. They've got some tag, and that's causing problems. And so you really can't attack the peer-to-peer networks this way. But when our signature is embedded in a way that MD5 is blind to, oh, we can spy on people all day. There are limits of tracing MP3s. I can only give someone information that they already have, that I can already see about them. In other words, yeah, I can, in my 128-bit signature, I can embed, say, their IP address, their username, time, date. I can embed a decent amount of information, but I can only embed what they've already told me. I can't, without a bunch of exploits, I can't have the MP3 spy on them, get a whole bunch more information, tell me where in the world they are or whatnot. But executables are really flexible, and I seem to be aware that people pirate software on the internet. And not only do they steal the software, they give it to their friends. So, check this out. This is kind of amusing. Someone goes ahead and gets their hand on a binary executable. They run the executable to make sure that it works, and if it works, they're going to give it to all their friends. That's what's supposed to happen. What happens in our case is the executable actually looks around, says, I seem to be running on this system. Let's see if we can get some information. What kind of information, say? Let's see, we got network data, their IP address, their DNS name, some browser cookies, and you can look at their online banking, let's say we want to take the money from our thief, cached into messenger credentials. We can, start pretending with them on all the IM networks. Peer-to-peer memberships, corporate identifiers, shipped material, the CPU ID, vendor ID, Windows activation key, system configurations. We can grab their time zone, their telephone API area code. We can grab wireless data. We can go ahead and get their MAC address and then look at all the Starbucks in the world and see if anyone's ever seen that MAC address. There's a million different ways that you can, given access to a system, try to figure out where it is if you were going to hunt someone down. But how are we going to get the data back? Well, we could try to send something out on the internet saying, hey, I've been pirated, and here's a bunch of spied information. But now we're using the network, and they might notice and not like that. So, as an alternative, we go ahead, and as they're installing the software, we modify the software. We modify the installer, and we embed a whole bunch of information about them right inside. We don't send any traffic. Actually, they do. They go ahead and they put the application on the peer-to-peer networks, they distribute it to all their friends and so on, and as it floats around, and in fact we can collect information on their friends too, because no matter how many people are embedding information inside, the MD5 hash isn't changing because it's completely blind to the algorithms that are being used. At least, let me clarify, this being used by Kazaa. And in fact, Kazaa has a ridiculously broken system I'll tell you about in a minute. So, the idea is we can actually there's actually an abuse of their own network traffic. We're piggybacking spy information on top of their systems. Moral of the story, don't trust MD5 if you want to avoid this kind of spying. So, there's a caveat. There's a sad thing, I must admit. None of this works without the actual attack. We can't make all these new doppelganger blocks. We can't chain anything but from the initial state. Didn't I say I had good stuff that worked today and not in some theoretical future when we get the attack from the Chinese? Oh, yeah, we do. Kazaa. I like Kazaa. Charmin Networks. Charmin's a brand of toilet paper in the States. I don't think this is a coincidence. So, Kazaa does not actually use MD5 in the standard mode. They do not hash the file from beginning to end. They use a variant of what Merkle called tiger trees. And the idea is that you break the file, after the first 300 kilobytes, you break the file into 32 kilobyte chunks. And each of these chunks is hashable independently. So as you're downloading, say, a 600 megabyte file, and you're getting it out of order, every time you get 32K, you take the hash, and eventually you XOR all the neighboring hashes together and you get some value. Why would you want to do this? 2 reasons. First of all, it makes it really efficient to be able to get a partial hash of some data. In other words, hey, I need the hash of this file from 1 meg to 20 meg. And you do that, and you get the hash, and you can now go ahead and do a integrity preserved resume. Also, after you download a 600 meg file, your machine doesn't have to sit there reading 600 megs off the drive. It's kind of nice. This used to be totally secure. There used to be no problem. It used to not really be that different that you were MD5ing from the beginning of the initial state instead of from whatever came before. But now we have the Wang attack. When you restart the hash every 32 kilobytes, the hash begins from the initial state every 32 kilobytes. When the hash begins from the initial state every 32K, well, we kind of have an exploit against the initial state. This exploit allows us to embed a single bit of information every time we see an initial state. With 32K chunks, we can embed 1 bit of information every 32 kilobytes. The average size of an MP3 after the 300K is chopped off is 4.2 megs. What does that give us? 128-bit signature in MP3s we can distribute on Kazaa today. So let's go ahead and actually do this. We're going to grab 32,760, 32K is 32,768. 32,768 minus 128, that's 32,640. We create a 32,640 file. We make vec1 to foo, gives us a bit 1. Vec2 with foo gives us a 0. We go ahead, we cat together, we'll take a couple 1s, 0, a couple more 1s, 0, 1, 0, and we take the KZ hash. What do we get? 76B57 blah blah. Now we take a completely different series of bits, 0, 0, 0, 0, 1, 1, 1, 1, whatever, and hey, will you take a look? Still completely different, completely same series of bits. And just to show you for a second that this actually works with real MP3 data, and there's a problem, and I'll show that to you too. So we have test done. Hang on, can someone bring a mic over there to him in a second? So we have these two files here, test and test2, MD5 sum.
Sorry, just wanted you to up the size of the font so everybody can see.
Not a problem. I did this yesterday. Little better. So we go ahead and we take the MD5s of these two files, and they contain lots and lots of bits of random information in between them. It's like 100 and actually by now we should have about 200 bits of information embedded inside. We go ahead and different MD5 sums. Now we go ahead and we let Kazaa get its work done. C48, C48. It complains, but it plays. So this is quite not theoretical. And just in case there's any possible nagging doubt that these risks are theoretical, I have a neat little demo. This would be vec1.c on docsparrow.com. This is the CNN webpage a little bit ago. Here we have vec2.c. That looks like the CCC webpage. Now let's go ahead and see the MD5 sums of both. Oops. It works better when you sum it. AC68F, we go ahead and we grab vec2. Remember, vec1 was CNN, vec2 is CCC. Oh, will you look at that same hash. All we're using is a stupid little bit of JavaScript. So, moral of the story, guys, we've known MD5 was broken. We knew it. We've been telling you guys, and everyone's been ignoring it. People, stop, please. It's going to get worse. So use SHA-1. If you're restricted to only using 128 bits, use SHA-1 and chunk it down to 128 bits. It's still going to be more secure than MD5. And there you go. Any questions?
So, wasn't how you said that there were multiple other hash algorithms where collisions were released?
Yes.
Wasn't one of them for SHA-0?
Released by a different group. it was a 2 to the 52 attack instead of a 2 to the like 24 to 32.
Okay.
And yes, SHA-0 is vulnerable,
But
but
isn't there
SHA-0 is ends up being substantially different than SHA-1 due to the left shift.
Well, I've heard from some people that there is a possible extension attack to SHA-1 from it. Do you know anything about that?
It happens to be true. People are very worried about hashing in general. We don't have a very, very well-liked replacement. Because things are just rumors right now, I'm not willing to say don't use SHA-1.
Okay.
But yeah, there's worry. You know what it is? It's like early 90s worry of MD5 is now what we have on SHA-1. And it's true. You know, the early 90s worry turned out correct. Are there any other questions? All right, well, I'll be hanging around. Find me around the Phenolith, guys.